Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, A Suicide Pact? The Confessional Poets. Confessional poetry, also known as the poetry of the personal or the poetry of I, was a style of poetry that emerged in the 1950s. It was highly personal, often autobiographical in nature, and often dealing with subjects that were not discussed openly in America at the time: mental illness, sexuality, depression, death, and suicide among them. These poems generally expose the intimate and often unflattering sides of a poet's life. Three well-known poets that were given the confessional poet label were Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, and Anne Sexton. Plath and Sexton were contemporaries and friends, both students at Lowell's poetry seminars at Boston University. Both Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton suffered from mental illnesses, and both women committed suicide. As confessional poets, death was often the subject matter in their work. But it wasn't only death that they were preoccupied with. It was the manner of death that seemed to fascinate them, often alluding to a violent or suicidal end. Although not a poem, Plath's novel The Bell Jar contains many of the same elements that define confessional poetry. The narrator-protagonist, Esther Greenwood, exhibits a preoccupation with death from the opening line. It was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs. As we learn more about Esther, it becomes clearer that this isn't a sentiment based on sensitivity to the political scene in America in the 1950s. Esther is far too self-involved to be overly concerned with events that don't affect her directly. Esther's interest in the Rosenbergs is in the manner of their deaths, the act of being electrocuted. She couldn't help wondering what it would be like being burned alive all along your nerves. It reminded her of other deaths she'd encountered, the first time I saw a cadaver. Esther knew something was wrong with her that summer because all she could think about was the Rosenbergs. As the bell jar descends further on Esther, she routinely thinks about death and violent ways of ending her life. I liked looking on at other people in crucial situations, a road accident or a street fight or a baby pickled in a laboratory jar. Esther goes skiing and throws all caution to the wind. The thought that I might kill myself formed in my mind coolly as a tree or a flower. She envisions jumping off of a building and thinks the trouble about jumping was that if you didn't pick the right number of stories, you might still be alive when you hit the bottom. She reads about the country of Japan and suddenly thinks they understood things in the spirit of Japan. They disemboweled themselves when anything went wrong. The confessional poems Lady Lazarus and Sylvia's Death. The story of Esther Greenwood in The Bell Jar emphasizes the intensity of Plath's fascination with, and ultimately her desire for, death. In Plath's poem Lady Lazarus, the speaker romanticizes the act of dying, recalling her near-death experiences, both accidental and suicidal, while equating herself to a saint as a sort of walking miracle, and a phoenix rising out of the ash with her red hair. Unlike Lazarus, however, the speaker appears to resent the fact that she can't complete the job. She considers death to be the ultimate prize, and Herr Doctor, or Herr Enemy, as denying her that prize. Just a quick introduction to Anne Sexton, since she's some people may not be familiar with her. Anne Sexton started writing at the suggestion of her therapist. She believed that the purpose of poetry was to shock the senses and to cause pain. And she wrote poems about sex, illegitimacy, guilt, and madness. She wrote and published several collections of her poetry, two of which, the Death Notebooks and the Awful Rowing Toward God, presented poems about suicide. Two of her poems target well-known individuals that took their own lives. The Starry Night pays homage to Vincent van Gogh's famous work painted while he was in an asylum shortly before he shot himself. And Sylvia's Death, of course, was written in 1963 and dedicated to her friend Sylvia Plath a few months after she killed herself in an oven. Sexton and Plath held similar attitudes about death. Lady Lazarus appears to look at suicide as a goal to be achieved, where Sexton's narrator, addressing Plath after her success, seems almost jealous, even a little resentful that her friend attained this prize before she could. So, was there a suicide pact between Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath? While an actual suicide pact may not have existed, both poets looked at death as a release rather than as a loss. Sexton describes death as a necessity in Sylvia's Death, and suicidal death as a triumph over their enemies. When the speaker cries thief and speaks of the death we said we both outgrew, it is with regret, a sense of envy, and a feeling of betrayal. It took another 11 years for Sexton to follow Plath and to take her own life. Just a quick look at the two graves of these friends and accomplished poets. I have provided some links here for you to read more about Anne Sexton. Obviously, we've read about Sylvia Plath, and some links also to the poems that I used excerpts from in this presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much.